started. Give me just a second. So I'll say good evening to everybody and welcome to the Needham Free Public Library's presentation of Peter Zheutlin's brand new book. We're happy to launch it. This has been I believe the fourth book we have launched for Peter over the years. Way back when the Friends were the ones who first launched his first book, Around the World on Two Wheels, back in 2007, Annie Londonderry's Extraordinary Ride, which this new novel is based on. Additionally, we were very pleased to host him for his Rescue Road, One Man, 30,000 Dogs, and 1,000,000 Miles on the Last Hope Highway. And the lovely book that he wrote with his great wife, who's also been had events here, the official Mad Men cookbook, Inside the Kitchen, Bars, and Restaurants of Mad Men. We also had the privilege of being able to launch here. Peter's a longtime friend of our building and of our library. He's a freelance journalist and author whose work regularly appears in the Boston Globe and the Christian Science Monitor. He's written multiple books and articles for publications abroad and at home. He lives close by, so we are thrilled to be able to have him. And for those who are interested in the book, we've asked and made arrangements with Wellesley Books to be able to have books available for you to purchase. And I'm sure they'll be talking to Peter about going over and autographing them, and you probably could request something too. So without further ado, let us start off with letting you know that we will be using the chat function for questions at the end, and we may indeed open it up for people to be able to ask them personally. So you can chat to everyone and just put your questions there and we'll ask them at the end. So without further ado, Peter, go ahead.
Thanks, Kay. Well, it says welcome to the Needham Public Library, but it's actually welcome to my bedroom, which is where I'm sitting. Zoom is sort of works both ways. On the one hand, I can talk to all of you. There are 80 people signed up for this talk from Maine to California to Washington State, and even in the heart of Texas, someone I'm going to mention in my talk in a few moments. So without any expense, no travel expense, no travel time, I can talk to a large group from all over the country. The downside, of course, is that I can't interact directly with any of you. And one thing I found is that humor often does not translate on Zoom. That being said, I did look over the registration list. I'd say 25% of you are close family, 25% are distant family, 25% are close friends, 20% are acquaintances, and 5% are people who are lost on the internet. But everybody is welcome. So here we are. I'm going to start by telling you the story behind the story, how it was that I came upon the story that became the basis of this novel and the previous book that Gay mentioned. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the social and historical context of the journey at the heart of this story, the real life journey at the heart of this story. And then, time allowing, I'm going to give you a very brief thumbnail of the journey itself. But I'm going to start, as I said, by telling you how this story came to me, because it's a story, it's a family. Oops, this is not allowing me to advance. That's interesting. This is a family story. The woman I'm writing about was my great-grandaunt. She was my great-grandfather's sister on my mother's side. But I never heard of her until I was 40 years old. And it all started in 1993 when my mother received a letter from a complete stranger, a gentleman named Michael Wells. And in the letter, he explained that he was researching the story of the first woman to bike around the world. And he laid out some genealogical research he had done that led him to conclude that my mother might be a descendant of this woman. My mother never heard of her. She knew nothing about the bicycle trip. And she asked me to reply to this man on her behalf. And I told him, it sounds like a great story, and I think you found the right family. It was pretty clear from the information in his letter, but we had nothing to add. We didn't know anything about it. His letter included a couple of newspaper clips, one from Boston in June of 1895, and another from a newspaper in Omaha in, I think, September of 1895. First one was 1894, excuse me. And so I was intrigued, but we didn't know anything. And I put all this material in my desk drawer, and I forgot about it for 10 years. In 2003, I got a letter from the same fellow, and he wanted to know if we had learned anything in the interim. And I had, over the years, asked people in my family about this, and always came up empty. Nobody knew anything. So this time, my interest was piqued, and I said, why? This story sounds so incredible and so eccentric and so improbable. Why is it that no one in my family has ever heard about it or heard about her? And so I decided to do a little bit of digging myself. And since the article that was enclosed in that first letter from Boston said that she had started this trip around the world by bicycle from the State House in Boston, I called the library there and spoke to a librarian named Ava Murphy. And what shocked me was I asked her if they might have some record, if she could look and see if there was some record of this woman's departure from the State House. She didn't even hesitate. She said, I know we don't have anything because I got an inquiry from a gentleman in Texas a few weeks ago about the same thing. And I thought, this was totally improbable. There was nothing on the internet about her. I couldn't imagine who else was onto this story. She said, I'll check with him and see if it's okay for you to get in touch with him. And she gave me his name. His name is Dennis McCown. He's on this call tonight. He lives deep in the heart of Texas in Lockhart. And if you go to Texas, if you're in Austin, go to Lockhart. It's the best barbecue in Texas, and that's saying something. And Dennis gave her permission, and I emailed Dennis and told him who I was. And I got this reply from Dennis. He said, oh my God, a relative of Annie Londonderry's. He had been onto her story and was trying to find out more about her. So Dennis and I eventually spoke. And Dennis told me a story, and I think I've got it pretty accurate. And I'm going to relate it to you. And it's going to seem like it's going nowhere, but I promise you it's going somewhere. So naturally, Dennis and I, after figuring out that we were not related, I asked him how in the world he was onto the story of this woman from Boston who was biking around the world. He lives in Texas. And Dennis told me that he was researching the story of an ancestor of his wife's, I believe, a woman named Helen Morose, who lived in El Paso in the mid-1890s. And she was married to a ne'er-do-well named Martin, who had been arrested, I think on a cattle rustling charge, and had taken refuge across the river in Juarez, Mexico. And Helen came back to El Paso to find a lawyer to represent him. And she hired a man named John Wesley Hardin. Now that name may ring a bell because John Wesley Hardin was one of the most notorious outlaws of the Old West. He had killed dozens of men by the time he was in his 20s, but in his older age, he had taken up residence in El Paso, naturally working as a lawyer. And long story short, he and Helen fell in love. They were having an affair. And on a night in early July, I believe it was, of 1895, 4 law enforcement officers in El Paso, paid by Hardin, lured Martin Morose back to El Paso and murdered him at the El Paso city dump. Now I'm thinking, okay, what does this have to do with Annie Cohen Kopchowski, better known as Annie Londonderry? I'll explain why in a moment. So Dennis naturally wanted to figure out where was Hardin on the night of this murder. And what he discovered from his newspaper research was that Hardin was at a theater listening to a young woman from Boston going around the world on her bicycle. This seemed so incredible to me that my great-grandaunt, Annie, this Jewish woman from Boston, had crossed paths with John Wesley Hardin. I had to find out more. And so I started digging. Now, Dennis had given me some articles from the El Paso newspapers, and one of them had an important clue. it said that she had headed north out of El Paso following the Santa Fe railway tracks. And so back in those days, it was pretty easy to find a map of the old Santa Fe. And I literally started calling libraries in these small towns where the railway used to go. And I would tell them what I was looking for, a woman named Annie Londonderry. And again, I'll tell you why she was called that. And sure enough, every small town library I called was able to find some little article about her passing through town. And as I started to pinpoint, stick pins in a map to map her route, and this is where I first really picked up her trail, I also went online to see if I could find a Jewish genealogist who would help me find any direct living descendants. And I'll explain that in a moment. And the first name that came up was a woman from Needham, where I lived, about a half a mile away. And I ended up hiring her, and I'll explain what happened. So who was Annie Londonderry? She was born Annie Cohen, my mother's maiden name. She was my great-grandfather's sister, born near Riga, Latvia, and came to the United States about the age of 5 with her family. She was married as a teenager in 1888 to an older man in an arranged marriage. Before she took off on this round-the-world trip on a bicycle, she had never ridden a bicycle in her life. And this was the most astonishing thing I found out early in my research. I came across a story in the New York World newspaper, one of the very few that ever mentioned the fact that she was a married mother of 3 children under the age of 5. I was astonished that she had children when she did this, but it also gave me hope because I realized that if any of those children had had children, they might still be alive today. And that was sort of Nancy, the genealogist's task. I wanted to find out, were there any more descendants who might shed light on this mystery? One Iowa newspaper called her an inventive genius. And that's really at the heart of this story, because she was a brilliant self-promoter, a teller of tall tales, a bit of a scoundrel, and she made up a lot of her own story. And so Spin, which is a historical fiction, is really historical fiction about a woman who was writing her own historical fiction in real time. To give you an idea of how fanciful she was, among the various things that she claimed to be as she talked to reporters around the world were a Harvard medical student. I actually called Harvard. Mr. Gullible called Harvard to see if he could find her transcript and was told that women were not admitted to Harvard until 1947, and this was 1895. She claimed to be a lawyer, an accountant, a wealthy heiress, an orphan, the inventor of a type of stenography, the founder of a newspaper, the cousin of a congressman, the niece of a senator. None of it was true, okay? This was only part of her building this persona that she adopted as she traveled. Now, when I started researching this story in 2003, this quickly became an exercise in sorting out fact from fiction, because I thought what I was setting out to do was to document her claim to the title of first woman to go around the world on a bicycle. And there came a point when I collected enough articles and had enough of a sense of the timeline that I realized it wasn't adding up. She was making too much ground, covering too much ground, particularly across Europe and Asia, for a woman who was biking all the way. And at first I was disappointed, but then I began to realize, I think I have a more interesting character on my hands than I initially thought. This is not just a woman on a bicycle using her muscle power to get around the world. Now, that book rippled out in many ways since it was published. But what led to my writing this as historical fiction in the new book was that in November of 2019, the New York Times did a belated obituary about her, relied a lot on my first book. This is a series of obits the Times is doing on people that were overlooked in their day and didn't get the recognition that they probably deserve, mostly women and people of color. And when this appeared, my wife, Judy, who's very tied into the book club world, said to me, you have to write this as historical fiction. You've already done the research, and somebody else will do it if you don't. That was not a request, it was a command. And so that's what led me to write Spin. So let me tell you a little bit about the backstory here. Annie is a young Jewish mother of 3 small children, not a person of means, living in the old West End of Boston, a neighborhood where Mass General Hospital now sits, a neighborhood that was pretty much destroyed in the 1950s for these urban renewal projects. It was one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the United States. Immigrants from all parts of the world congregated in this small Boston enclave. So a young woman, who might be dreaming about other parts of the world would have had her curiosity piqued by hearing different languages spoken, the different food aromas that would emanate from these tenements in the summer. This illustration appeared in Punch magazine the year after she finished her trip. I don't know for a fact it was inspired by her story, but it captures her story. Here she was, this sort of free-thinking, independent woman stuck in the drudgery of a marriage in her early 20s with 3 young children to take care of, and not terribly happy in her domestic life. But what catalyzed this whole adventure? Well, it was widely reported all over the world, and I've collected well over 1,000 newspaper accounts of her trip from all parts of the world because she was such a skilled self-promoter. It started with a wager, supposedly, between 2 wealthy Boston merchants who were debating the question of women's equality, a very hotly contested topic in the 1890s. And the wager was $20,000 to $10,000 that a woman could not do what only a man had done before, which is ride a bicycle around the world. She had to make the trip in 15 months and cover at least 10,000 miles on the bike. She had to begin without a penny in her pocket and earn, this is a lot of money in those days, $5,000 en route. So the point was, this is not just a test of a woman's physical endurance. It was a test of a woman's ability to fend for herself in the world. She was to win a $10,000 prize if she succeeded. And she added other conditions along the way as they were convenient to her, as she talked to reporters, particularly reporters who were smitten with her. She often said that the wager prohibited her from contracting matrimony on the trip. So let's talk for a moment about the social and historical context of this, because this didn't just happen in a vacuum. There were 3 things happening in the 1890s that really all came together in this journey. One was what I call an early era of globalization. You could now sail from New York to France in less than a week. News traveled around the world in a matter of hours by telegraph. So the world was literally shrinking for people, and they were curious about the wider world. And for people who didn't have the means to travel, world travelers became a form of entertainment, and I'll talk about that, kind of the reality TV stars of their day. So that was the first. The second was the intense popularity of the bicycle in the 1890s, when the sport really opened up to women for reasons I'll explain. And the third was this women's movement for social and economic equality and the campaign for the right to vote. These women who were pushing the boundaries were called the new woman. That was the term that was commonly used. So as I said, these round-the-world travelers really captured the popular imagination in those days. And the first person to go around the world by bicycle was this gentleman, Thomas Stevens, who made the trip over 3 years on a high-wheel bicycle. Annie's trip has a lineage. If it sounds familiar, this idea of going around the world on this wager, back in 1872, Jules Verne sort of captured the spirit of the age with his book Around the World in 80 Days. And you may remember it was a wager. Phileas Fogg was took a wager to see whether he could go around the world in 80 days. Now, that was a really widely read novel. Nellie Bly, who was the most famous female journalist, maybe the most famous journalist of her day, what they called a girl stunt journalist, her most popular story was a trip she made around the world to try and beat that fictional record that Jules Verne had established. And she wrote about it for the New York World in serial form and gained a massive audience. She became an international celebrity for this trip. It was so popular, there was even a board game that was a big seller to commemorate her trip. So that's some of the lineage of this. Now, I also mentioned the bicycle craze. So millions of bicycles were being sold in those days. Up until the 1880s, the bicycle was the device that you see on the screen, called an ordinary or a penny farthing. These were very difficult bicycles to ride. Just to get on them was difficult. But what, and they were challenging and they were dangerous. But what opened the sport to women was the invention of the so-called safety bicycle, which had a chain drive, so you could have wheels of equal size. It was a safer bicycle. And this is what opened it all up for women. Women, by the scores, took to the bicycle because it was a form of liberation. Frances Willard, who founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union, learned to ride a bicycle at 53, wrote a book about it because she said she wanted to take this implement of power and literally put it at my feet. So cycling challenged all these Victorian conventions about women, where women were not supposed to be seen in public exerting themselves or sweating or, God forbid, showing, any leg. So even the moral propriety of women cycling was hotly debated. Doctors got in on the argument. Some said that it would, impede a woman's ability to reproduce, or would have other adverse health effects. It led to changes in the way women dressed because the long skirts that women were used to wearing were totally impractical for biking. So getting a bicycle was, in a very real sense, a woman's declaration of independence, and it became Annie's means of escape. Now, advertisers promised women this sense of liberation and freedom that came with riding, and it's very evident when you look at the advertising posters of the day. I mean, you can see how sort of sensual they are. They kind of seeking to debunk the idea that a woman on a bicycle was somehow masculine. They celebrated femininity, freedom. You can just see it captured in these images. And I like the larger one because it literally shows a woman on a bicycle conquering the world, so to speak, as Annie was going to set out to do. And so the bicycle really became an emblem of the women's suffrage movement. So impactful that Susan B. Anthony, in an interview with Nellie Bly, shortly after Annie's trip, said that bicycling had done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world. So that's the sort of social and historical context. So now I'm going to take you to the quote unquote real story that underpins the novel. I give you the bare outlines of it. So this is where the trip begins on a day in June of 1894 before a crowd of 500 people who had come, including a lot of suffragists, curious onlookers, family, and friends. One newspaper reported that my great-grandfather Bennett had come, but he couldn't even look up and wouldn't even come to say goodbye to her, because I suspect that the responsibility for these 3 children that she was leaving behind with a husband who was a peddler fell to my great-grandparents who lived in the same apartment building with their 2 young kids, including my grandfather. And I also suspect that my great-grandfather thought this was absolutely a shame and an embarrassment, and that she wasn't really going to get very far with this stunt. This formal portrait of Annie was taken the day that she left Boston. And I'm going to tell you how I found out about it. About a year into my research, that genealogist I had hired called me. And she said, "I think I've got it." And what she was referring to was that she had found Annie's burial plot in a New Jersey cemetery. And some of the people on this call are going to appreciate this. My cousin Jane, for example. It turns out, although she is on my mother's side, she's buried just within a stone's throw of my paternal grandparents, unrelated, in the same New Jersey cemetery. And she said, I think we've got it. I mean, Annie's name was Kopchovsky. Many names were shortened. Her maiden name was Cohen. It was a long search to try and find out more about her. And the cemetery records listed a woman named Mary Goldiner in Larchmont, New York, as the contact. So when I got this information, I was really excited, and I wrote this woman, Mary, a letter. I didn't know if we were related. I didn't know if she was alive. I didn't know if she'd be interested in hearing from me, even if she were. And I explained who I was and what I was interested in. And I had never seen a picture of Annie. And 10 days later, the phone rang, and a woman with this kind of gravelly voice, she said, "Peter, this is your long-lost cousin, Mary." And I was so thrilled that after a year of research, I had found her. She's my second cousin once removed. She's Annie's only direct living descendant. And a week later, I was in her living room, and she had this picture in a frame with the bottom part cut off. But I knew from my research that Annie had had these formal portraits taken at a studio called Town Portrait Studio. And she took it out, and there it was. And I knew this was the picture taken the day that she left. Now, a couple of things to point out about this. This Columbia bicycle, provided by the Pope Manufacturing Company, which is one of the big bicycle companies of the time, it weighed 42 pounds. It was a monster of a bicycle in those days. You could see it as a drop frame that women could step through to accommodate their skirts. On her lapel is a white ribbon. That's the symbol of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, although she's Jewish. But the WCTU was the largest women's organization of the day, with millions of members advocating for women's equality. But the most interesting thing in this picture is the placard on the back of the bike. It says at Londonderry. I think the next picture, do I have that? Yeah. So Annie was a newspaper solicitor. She sold advertising on a commission basis. She worked outside the home. So she would have had contact in her work with a lot of New England-based companies. Now, whether they were a client of hers, I don't know. But her first corporate sponsor, now think about this, is 1894, well before athletes were wearing Nike logos and so forth. She convinced them to sponsor her, the first of many advertisers who purchased space, and I'll talk more about this, on her bicycle and on her body, and paid her, because keep in mind, the wager required that she earn her way around the world. One of the ways she did it was selling advertising space on her bike and her body. So this is the logo of the Londonderry Lithia Spring Water Company of Nashua, New Hampshire. The spring itself was located in the town of Londonderry, New Hampshire. They paid her $100 to affix this placard to her bike. As you can see, it's attached to a screen mesh, which is a skirt guard. That was designed to keep those long skirts from getting caught in the spokes of the bike. And she adopted the name and became famous as Annie Londonderry. She reinvented herself as a completely new person as she went. So that's how she acquired the name Annie Londonderry. It served another purpose, is my surmise. It concealed her Jewish heritage. It probably eased her passage through places like France, where anti-Semitism was quite virulent, particularly in France in those days. It might have eased her passage to travel under this assumed name. This ad happens to be from much later in her trip. It appeared in a Denver newspaper. It's one of the only example I've ever found of how the water company used her as to advertise their product. And you can see that the image of her on her bike, and people from all over the world sort of celebrating her. So again, she was a pioneer of sports-related marketing. I don't know of an earlier example of a woman engaged in that practice. So this is how one Boston newspaper described her departure. She gets on the bike and she's carrying a change of clothes, and this is true, a pearl-handled revolver, and she sails away like a kite down Beacon Street, an image that I absolutely love. I'm sure she had less experience with the revolver than she did with the bike, but it was something that she constantly showed reporters, because it added sort of drama to her story. She needed this for her protection. So her first stop, so to speak, is she takes about a week going to New York City. She was going to make her way west across the United States. She gets to New York, where she inexplicably spends several weeks making connections at the New York World newspaper for reasons I'll talk about, and tinkering with her clothing, because she quickly finds out that these long skirts are completely impractical. So she finds ways to pin them up and to, adjust her clothing to make for a more comfortable ride. She would have had these road books. There were actually very detailed instructions available for cyclists in those days in these little map-sized books that would lead her all the way to Chicago. This is the way she was depicted in the New York World newspaper when she arrived in New York. She then rides north to Albany. Again, she's kind of ridden south to New York, then up to Albany. And now she's going to follow the Erie Canal across New York because it's flat. There's a path that follows the canal all the way to Chicago. But it takes her 3 months out of the 15 months just to get to Chicago. She's not in shape. She's not experienced riding a bicycle. She's on this behemoth of a bike. And she gets to Chicago, realizes no doubt she's never going to make it to the West Coast before the winter, and decides she's going to give up this trip around the world, and she's just going to try and set her speed record back to New York. But then something happens in Chicago, and she changes her mind. She makes contact with the Sterling Bicycle Company, and they offer her this bicycle. This picture was taken in San Francisco in 1895. It's a men's bicycle, as you can see. It's a man's frame. It weighed 21 pounds, half the weight of her previous bicycle. It had no brake at all, but it was much more comfortable for riding. So she gets this lighter bicycle, and she makes a change in her clothing that makes it much easier to ride. This was from an advertisement that Sterling Bicycles, another one of her sponsors, used in various cycling magazines. And you can see she's now attired in bloomers, far more practical clothing for cycling. And she again changes her mind, tells the press, I am going to go back around the world. She's now got 12 months to do it, and she's got to get back to Chicago to complete the circuit. So she rides back to New York. As she's riding back to New York, her fame is really starting to grow, and it becomes much easier for her to attract advertisers. So when she gets to Buffalo, she's described this way: as a riding advertising agency. She would arrive in these towns and she would solicit, banners and little ribbons she would stitch to her clothing or affix to the bicycle and ride through town. She was a real spectacle. I wrote in the first book that she didn't run away to join the circus. She became the circus. She was all about making a spectacle of herself and telling whatever stories she needed to tell to make sure she got a lot of ink. She's described this way in the Buffalo Express. This is a photograph, one of the rare newspaper photographs of her. You can't really see it too clearly, but that white patch on her sleeve is an advertisement for something. I don't know what. So she's making her way back to New York. She's earning money as an advertising medium and giving talks about her trip so far, talks that are filled with tales of danger, of being on the railway tracks, crossing a railroad trestle when a speeding train comes at her at full speed and she's just able to dangle off the side of the bridge with her bicycle in one hand. I mean, all kinds of fanciful stories that appeal to the press. I'm I'm covering a lot of ground very fast just to give you a flavor of this. When she was in the United States, both at the beginning of her trip and when she returns, the way she's described in the press is very flattering. A lot of reporters were very smitten with her. They comment constantly on her appearance, that she's, just a good-looking woman. She's going to have lots of offers of marriage. They don't know that she's married. Many of them actually hit on her, these are the ones she tells she's not allowed to contract matrimony during the course of the trip. One El Paso reporter even wrote that any man who says she's not good looking should be taken in back of a cowshed and knocked in the head with an axe. That changes when she gets to France. I don't know whether it was the French notions of femininity or the fact that she had become a little bit more muscular on her trip. But this is what, I think we would all agree. She looks very feminine and attractive in this picture. But here's how she's described by one newspaper in France. She belongs to that category of neutered beings, single women without a husband or children, little did they know. The suppression of love and maternal function so profoundly alters in them any feminine personality. They're neither men nor women and really constitute a third sex. So part of this story is the way she really challenged Victorian notions of femininity, gender roles. Keep in mind, she's now riding a man's bicycle. She's attired in bloomers and would eventually be riding in a men's riding suit. So a very different perception of her. And you can see even in this illustration from a French newspaper that she just appears more masculine in this image. And you can see on her, I'm pointing to it, you can't see me point to it, but on her thigh and her knee are little advertisements, which she collected again in France. She was very popular, one newspaper said, as an advertising medium in France. And this is a depiction of her in one of the French newspapers as she makes her way south through France in the winter. Now, I'm going to skip a lot of ground, as Annie herself did. I have to tell you that Annie had no qualms about telling two different reporters from two different newspapers in the same city two completely different accounts of how she traversed Asia. To some, she claimed she had ridden across Asia. Some, she just readily confessed to being on a steamer most of the way. She did sail from Marseille towards the Suez Canal, made a brief trip to Jerusalem, back on the steamer through parts of Asia. There was a war between China and Japan at this time over control of Korea. It was winding down. It was widely covered in the American press. And she decided that when she got back to the United States, she could make a good living as a lecturer, particularly if she claimed to be a witness to the events of this war. My conclusion was she probably never saw any of this, but it didn't prevent her from writing this in her only first-person account of the trip when it was over for the New York World. And this gives you an idea of how comfortable she was sensationalizing her own experience almost beyond belief, right? That she claimed to her that she was thrown in a prison and watched a Chinese prisoner, killed right before her eyes, and the soldier drank his blood while the muscles were yet quivering. So this is the kind of personality she brought to this task. She sails from Yokohama and arrives back in California in the spring of 1895. In the company of a young male cyclist, a well-known cyclist named Mark Johnson from San Francisco, she takes 6 leisurely weeks riding to Los Angeles. I should have mentioned, this is the way she was depicted, by the way, in the San Francisco Examiner when she arrived. Now, she wanted material to sensationalize the lecture she was preparing to give, and one of which was attended by John Wesley Hardin. So she had this photograph taken outside of San Francisco. I mean, obviously, this is not a candid photo of a couple of bandits who happened to hold her up, although she had many stories. Some of them were set in New York, some were set in France, of being accosted by bandits. So she used pictures like this to illustrate her lectures. she had, I'll show one to you. These were in the form of lantern slides, many of which she collected. They were sold like postcards. This is happens to be you can't really see the image of a tattooed Japanese laborer, but these were used. She collected them, she shipped them ahead, and they were able to be projected on a screen. So she lectured all the way from San Francisco across the West and included images like the one that you see here that dramatize those lectures. Now, the toughest part of the trip is crossing the Sonora Desert into Arizona and New Mexico from California. Now, this is the way the New York World depicted this part of the journey when she wrote her first person account of the trip a couple of months after she got back. Now, this may seem preposterous, the idea that someone would literally be riding on the railroad tracks. But in fact, out in the expanse of the desert, and keep in mind that Phoenix, there were 3,000 people in Phoenix in 1895, 5,000 in Tucson. This is countless miles of uncharted territory, all of which looks almost exactly the same. So the safest way to travel was to literally ride the rails between settlements or adjacent to the tracks if you had to. And also, if you ran into trouble, eventually a passing train would come by. But the one thing I want to point out about this image, if you look at the caption, and this was the byline on her first person account for the New York World, Nellie Bly Jr.'s journey. So Nellie Bly, again, the most famous journalist of her day, had recently had a falling out. She had left the New York World, came back, and then left again in a dispute with her editors. And I suspect, I don't know this to be true, that this was the New York World's way of telling Nellie Bly, we've got it covered. We've got someone else to take your place. Don't get too cocky. So her story, even though she became famous as Annie Londonderry, was bylined Nellie Bly Jr. And this was the headline of that story that appeared about a month after Annie finished the trip in Chicago. And again, I have to skip a lot of ground for time's sake, but you can see the way it was sensationalized. The New York World, I often describe to people, it would be what you had if the New York Times merged with the National Enquirer. One of the things that's interesting about this story is what it tells you about journalism in those days too. The sensationalism, the almost the freak show quality of some of the features that would appear in newspapers like the New York World, really sensational stuff. This is, to my knowledge, and it took up a whole page in the Sunday edition, the only first-person account that she ever wrote of her trip. And to give you an idea of how casual her relationship was with the facts of her own story, even though she was very publicly committed to this story that the wager required that she ride 10,000 miles on her bicycle. In the story, she says she rode 9,604 miles, a very precise number, but short of the number she was publicly committed to. But this is the way the story begins. I am a new woman, if that term means I believe I can do anything any man can do. When I met Annie's granddaughter, Mary, I asked her about her grandmother's commitment. Was she a feminist? I asked her. And Mary knew Annie because Mary was 16 when Annie died. And Annie told stories about this bike trip all her life to her children and grandchildren, but never, by the way, in the presence of her husband, to whom she stayed married. They had a fourth child after the bike trip. That's the one that gave birth to Mary. And I asked Mary about her grandmother being a feminist. She said, she wasn't really active in the women's movement. My conclusion, she really seized on it to build her fame. But Mary said she was really a feminist in the sense that she really believed that a woman should take control of her own destiny. And I think that really is a good way to sum it up. This is the last known picture I have of Annie with Max, her husband, her very patient husband, whom she left behind for 15 months to gallivant around the world on a bicycle. One of the things I should say that's happened, this story has rippled out in many ways since the first book. It's been the subject of a musical in Canada, another in the UK, a play that's being produced this summer in Italy, the Travel Channel, children's books, perfume, soaps. So many things have happened. One of the other things that's happened is I've met some of my distant cousins that I never knew before, some of whom are on this call. Jackie is here from Tuscaloosa, and Stephanie, I think, is here from out in Washington State, who are my third cousins, descendants of Annie's sister. So this picture was taken in 1947, shortly before, 1946, probably not long before Max died. And then Annie, who went into business after a brief stint at the New York World, in which she wrote a series of spectacular feature stories in the vein of Nellie Bly over a period of about 6 months. She went into business for herself. They had a small, they made handbags and novelty items, kind of clothing business that she operated right up until the day she died in November of 1947. So I'm going to stop the screen share and ask folks to, if you have questions, I'm going to open the chat. And I'll see if, I'm going to see if I can read some of these, or if Gay wants to.
There wasn't anything in the chat. So go ahead, guys. If you want to, you can unmute your microphones. And if you've got questions, go ahead and ask.
Yeah, one comment here. Someone said they believe Coca-Cola was using athlete endorsements. I think they meant by 1890, not 1980. Yes, that's true. But they were men. Like, there were a lot of male bicycle racers who had endorsements from tire companies. I've looked. I can't say for sure. You don't know what may be eluding you when you do this kind of research. But the only other example of a woman's association with a particular product that I was able to find was actually contemporaneous to Annie. And ironically, it was also the Sterling Bicycle Company. One of the popular forms of advertising were these kind of almost like trading cards that you could get. And Annie Oakley, the famous markswoman, sometimes performed her sharpshooting routine while riding a Sterling bicycle. And so you can find on the internet a copy of this image of Annie Oakley. It says Annie Oakley rides the Sterling. So Annie Oakley and Annie Londonderry, to my knowledge, I haven't found any earlier examples. That isn't to say they don't exist. Mary and Jeff also said the New York World was owned by the Pulitzers. That is correct. And in fact, by this time, 1894, 1895, I recently read a biography of Pulitzer. He was nearly blind at this point. He was a recluse who was constantly moving around the world. He had an extraordinary sensitivity to sound, and he was always trying to find places where he could find absolute serenity. And he was trying to run the New York World at a distance, and there was a lot of turnover at the New York World at that time. Annie's granddaughter, Mary, always thought, probably because Annie herself told her, that Pulitzer was behind this whole scheme. I don't think that's true. I went to the Pulitzer archive at Columbia. I found no evidence of that. And as I said, Pulitzer by this point was not actively running the world, the New York World. But I do have correspondence, original correspondence, between Annie and some of the senior editors at the New York World as they were dispatching her on various assignments. Let's see, and yeah, the yellow journalism, that's right. I don't have time to go into all that, but I often wondered, what was the role of Pulitzer in this? Clearly the New York World, which later claimed, I don't know if she actually carried it, but in the first person account they published, they claimed to have provided Annie with a letter of credentials. Leisha asked, what happened to Annie's bicycle? Is it in a museum? That's a really great question. There is a bicycle in a museum at the moment, but it's another bicycle. I tried to find the bicycle. I was people who were on this call who lived through this with me. When I was researching the first book, I spent 4 obsessive years on this. I wrote to the Smithsonian. I even wrote a dear occupant letter to the address of the house that Annie bought in the Bronx when she moved her family to New York shortly after the trip, saying, I know this is going to sound very weird, but is there by any chance an old bicycle in your basement? I never heard back, not surprisingly. But I did find an 1895 Sterling bicycle, a men's bicycle, that I had restored by a guy named Dick Rath, who may be with us tonight, who does magnificent restorations of antique bikes. And we recreated that bike down to the original color. Some of the parts had to be fabricated from scratch. And that bike is now on loan to a museum exhibit that started in Jerusalem, made its way to Germany. I believe it's in Warsaw now, and it's going to end up in Ottawa this summer. So no, I never did find the original bicycle, but I tried. Sue asks about the logistics. She says, mind-boggling. How did she know where to go, where to stay? Yes, this was improvisational art in a very high form. As I mentioned, as she traveled in the U.S., the eastern U.S., she would have had these road books that would have given her very specific directions. But most of the riding she actually did was in the United States and in France, where cycling was very popular. So, and there were bicycle clubs in almost every town and city, and she was very adept at using the telegraph to announce her arrival, and she was escorted by riders who wanted to share the miles. So, riders would ride out to meet her in the desert from Tucson and escort her into Tucson, and then another party would lead her on the way. So it was kind of in relay fashion that these parties of escorts, almost to my knowledge, all men, would escort her from town to town. Now, Janet asks the $64,000 question, or the $10,000 question. Did she win the bet or lose because she didn't complete the miles or the funding? Oh, boy, this is hard to talk about without giving away too much. But as I said to you, Annie was a great improviser, an inventive genius. And the question of whether there was actually a wager at all, I would say, is something of an open question. Was it something that she invented? Did she come up with this idea and basically turn this into an early iteration? Most of you are probably old enough to remember, of the Billie Jean King, Bobby Riggs tennis match. If you think about it, it's one thing to say I'm going around the world on a bicycle. If you say I'm doing it to settle a wager, anyone with a wager over the capabilities of a woman at a time when that topic was hotly debated, wherever you stood on the question of women's equality, you would have had a vested interest in the outcome, right? She was either going to vindicate women or vindicate the chauvinists. By putting a timeline on it, 15 months, she turns it into a race around the world. Okay? As I said, people were really eager, readers of newspapers were really eager to follow the adventures of these world travelers. They were a form of entertainment. You were able to explore the world vicariously through their exploits. And so this whole wager story gave it an element of drama it would have lacked otherwise. I can't prove one way or the other, but I will tell you that the world traveler on a wager was kind of a bit of a fad, frankly, in those days. There were a number of people going around the world by different means, ostensibly to settle wagers, to the point where some newspapers said, we're getting one a week. One traveler a week is coming through town on a wager. So I can't answer the question definitively, but I think it's up for grabs. Mary and Jeff, I'll add this privately. If you go to my website, annielondonderry.com, message me privately, the answer is yes, and we'll work that out. Are there any other questions? Or I think you might be able to wave and ask a question. I'm not sure.
Is there anybody who wants to ask one in person? Go for it. You'll need to unmute yourselves to do so.
Anyone else? Written question? Okay, if there are,
I think we may be done. If you have no more questions, I think we're done.
Okay, I hate to do this. If you read the book and you like the book, this is a little bit. Do me a favor, review it on Amazon and Goodreads if you participate in Goodreads. These are really important for authors. I'll let you. If you don't like the book, email me privately, and I'll answer all your criticisms. Did someone have a question? No? Okay. Lois says, thank you for the shout out to my librarian friend, Ava Murphy. I haven't been in touch with Ava since the very beginning of this, back in 2003. If it's okay, I'm going to ask myself one question.
Go for it.
I've talked to a number of book groups already about this book. And if you're in a book group, I'm happy to join your discussion remotely. I always recommend to book groups that if you're discussing the book and you want me to join, take the first half hour to let it fly so you don't have to worry about offending me. So you can have an honest discussion about it. But I was expecting to get a lot of questions when I talk to book groups about how, because this book is written in Annie's voice. It's in the form of her writing as an older woman a letter to her granddaughter, Mary. And I thought I might get a lot of pushback about a male writing as a woman. And could a male author credibly voice a woman? And I'm surprised no one's actually, it hasn't come up yet. So I'm bringing it up. So I'll leave that to you to decide if you think I pulled it off. So I think that's it. If there are no more questions, I want to thank everybody from all over the country, from my close and distant relatives, and everybody who's been so supportive. And I hope you'll go out and get the book. Whether you order online, I also want to urge people to support their independent bookstores, their independent booksellers. And if you want to give it as a gift and we can't find a way to do it in person, I'm happy to sign a book plate and just mail it to you. And again, so if you go to the website, AnnieLondonderry.com, you can contact me that way.
So on behalf of the Needham Free Public Library, I want to thank you, Peter, for allowing us to yet again launch another book for you. Thank you all for coming this evening. We do have lots of activities up on our website listed, not so much adults, but we do have some book clubs. They'll be continuing through the summer. And watch out for our new website, which should be premiering at the end of the month. It's a vast improvement, believe me, of what we've been currently dealing with, and it's going to be gorgeous. So check us out there, and we'll see you all back in the fall with new events. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.